close out last week in our discussion on eschatology and apocalypticism. We saw with Ezekiel, we had some elements of apocalyptic literature, and of course with Daniel, very, very strong elements. But we focused on with the discussion board, and what I want to just spend a couple minutes here talking about the issue of Son of God. What we saw with both Daniel and Ezekiel is that this was the same phrase, but used in different ways. With Daniel, there seemed to be more of an emphasis on a divine figure, or at least non-earthly figure, and of course we know through further revelation what that was. And Ezekiel is more the human nature of Ezekiel as a man. What this teaches us generally, if we want to take this to the broader aspect of biblical interpretation, is that a phrase in and of itself only has meaning within its immediate context. A lot of times what we see in biblical interpretation and in Bible studies is someone will take a phrase and say, well, this phrase is used this way in these other books, therefore it must mean that here, and bring all of that baggage with it. Well, we have to be very careful in doing that in the sense that Ezekiel and Daniel, both prophesying in the exile, are using very different, using the same term but very differently. And so we must understand that if we're going to interpret a phrase, yes, there is such a thing as loaded language. Jesus certainly uses that when he uses Son of Man. But we must pay attention primarily to its immediate context. Context is key when it comes to interpretation here, and context is what's going to determine the meaning of this phrase. And this goes to when we talk about Jesus and ask, how is Jesus using this phrase? Well, we have to use it by case, a context-by-context basis, and say, if Jesus is using Son of Man here, is he referring to his divine nature or his human nature? Well, we'll look at the immediate context, because what we've seen from Daniel and Ezekiel is just the phrase itself can hold both meanings. So we have to be very careful, and this applies to any term and any phrase that we want. This goes across the Old Testament and the New. But what this also shows us is a lot of times Jesus will use a phrase or a term and not explain its meaning. The context gives us clues, but he doesn't explain it because he expects his audience to understand the Old Testament. This is a great lesson in how we use the Old Testament. Obviously, the Old Testament in and of itself gives us great theology, great insights, but when we're interpreting the New Testament, we understand that it assumes that we understand the Old Testament, that we've read it, and we know these phrases, and we know Old Testament theology, and it takes that for granted. So the better we understand the Old Testament, the better we can understand the whole revelation of Scripture and all that God is trying to teach us.